Hello everyone, this is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. A case of business email compromise where the vendor sued the buyer when the buyer made a fraudulent payment to a fraudster that was impersonating the vendor. A classic business email compromise scam goes to court. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 323, a fraudulent payment after a BEC scam goes to court. Who won? Well, I saw this posted in right after we got back from Christmas and the New Year, and I thought this is a very classic case that has what could be some surprising results for those that think, you know what, it's all the vendor's fault. And so let's find out some background on it to see why you may think it's the vendor's fault. But first, I just want to clarify what BEC or business email compromise is. And traditionally, it has been that scam has been an email scam where the fraudster will send an email either from a spoofed email account to make you think it's the vendor, right? Maybe it has an extra letter in it. Or nowadays, they are actually in the vendor's account email box because they've been able to get their email credentials either from a previous phishing attack, or because they purchase that information off of the dark web. I mean, how many breaches have we all been in? And all of our information is out there, all of our sign-in information. So in any event, an email comes to the buyer, the vendor's client, in this case, you, or in this case, it was with a company called Inotech, Pty Limited, and the vendor was Mobius Group. But anyway, the framework, right, is you get the email in, and the email is from the fraudster, and the fraudster says, hey, change my bank details. Although nowadays it could be change my remittance address so they can get the check payment forward to them too to perpetrate check fraud. But anyway, the email comes in, change my bank details. The banking details get changed, post any successful validation processes that you have in place. Most likely the telephone call, which is what they had in place here. And then once successful confirmation is made, the bank account is updated and the payment is made to the new bank account. But in the BEC world of scams, right, it was a fraudster's email all along, and though that payment goes to a fraudulent account. And that's exactly what happened in this case. Again, it was between Mobius Group Pty Limited, and that was the vendor and the plaintiff, or the plaintiff in the case. So they brought the sued their client, which was Initech Pty Limited, because Inotech, and I'll just call them Mobius and Inotech. So Mobius, the vendor, sued Inotech because Inotech processed a bank change from a fraudulent email, from this business email compromise scam, and the payment went to the fraudster. So that's the background. Now, after that, Mobius sued Inotech, right, for that payment. But then, as a response to that, Inotech sought repayment of the fraudulent invoice from Mobius because if you think about it, they're both out of funds. Mobius didn't receive the payment for the invoice, and then Inotech will never get the money back that they sent to the fraudster. And Mobius is trying to get the payment back from Inotech, which means Inotech will be out of both the fraudulent payment and the repayment for the original invoice. And I know that a lot of companies will do that, and they will use their, I guess, insurance coverage to cover whatever the funds were. And they actually don't say how much it was, but typically, insurance coverage is capped at a certain amount for these types of payments. But some companies will use their insurance plan to be reimbursed for either the amount or a portion of the amount that was paid fraudulently. So they keep the vendor whole and then they file an insurance claims. But not all insurance plans cover the total amount of the loss, and not all companies have insurance. All right, so we've gotten to the point where Mobius is suing Inotech, and then Inotech is seeking repayment of the amount they sent to the fraudster because they thought they sent it to the bank account for Mobius. Now, who won the case? Well, before we look at that, there are some extenuating circumstances that the judge had to look at. First, two issues. Inotech had actually attempted to confirm the change in bank details via that confirmation call. But the problem is that when they made the call, they couldn't really understand, like the connection, the phone connection was bad. And so they couldn't understand the conversation. They couldn't hear the other person confirm the bank change. And for me, thinking about that, that is a kind of a hint and a half that it might be something with that phone connection, with the phone number that was used. And they don't say whether or not the telephone number that they used, Inotech used to make the confirmation call, was in the email, which could be a hint and a half, right? That it's a invalid overseas, right, telephone number. And that's why there was connection issues versus using the phone number that is in the vendor master file or somewhere in the contract or from the internal team member that has the relationship with the vendor. And note, I did not say the website because number one, fraudsters will, especially nowadays with Gen AI, they can create spoofed websites to make it appear that it's your actual vendor, and then give wrong phone numbers, wrong communication information, emails too, and that works really well now, especially since they have the budget and SEO knowledge, right, to get in the top results. They're doing what do you call that, ads to get in the top results. Not to mention that a lot of vendors are taking their accounts receivable team members, they're taking their name and communication information off of their legitimate websites because they don't want to have fraud. And so now, if you don't already have the vendor's communication information, their telephone number, their email address in your vendor master file, then You may know that you're not supposed to do that, but maybe your direct reports don't know that they're not supposed to use the information in email. In any event, the court case write up does not say if that happened. But what they did say happened is that because the person from Initech could not understand the confirmation via phone, they turned around and then sent a request for confirmation via email. Now, again, they don't say whether that email address that was used for the confirmation was taken from the email requesting the change, or if it was from an email address that was on their vendor master file. One of the things, though, I do want to say is that sending a confirmation by email can be valid. Number one, it needs to be a part of your process. So if your process, internal control says you make that phone call, then you know what? You need to make that phone call. But if it says you can make a confirmation either by phone or email, you need to take steps within that email, actually that confirmation call too, because you need to make sure that you are authenticating who you are communicating with. And I did a series just before Christmas, a podcast series on using confirmation call scripts so that you can build in authentication, so that whether you're doing it by phone or in this case by email, you know who you are talking to or communicating with, whether or not it's the actual vendor, or whether it is a fraudster. Now, if you want to take a look at those, because I do give you the confirmation call script verbiage, it is 5 episodes, and it starts with episode 315 and goes all the way to episode 319. So check those out if you are interested. All right, so that was one thing, is that the judge said that Initech really hadn't gone far enough in its verification of that change. And the second thing or decision that the judge found was that Inotech had not proven, because remember, Inotech also sued to get the repayment of that invoice to the fraudulent bank account. They sued to get that back from Mobius. And what the judge found is that Inotech had not proven that Mobius had failed to properly secure its email accounts. And so, as you can imagine, based on those two things, Inotech was unsuccessful, and it was ordered to pay the actual invoice to Mobius. So, in effect, it had to pay twice. It had to pay Mobius, even though it was Mobius's account that was hacked, the actual account. So they had to pay Mobius, and they had to, right, they were not able to recover the payment to the fraudster. So in effect, they had to pay that invoice twice. Now, here's the biggest takeaway I think we all need to take from this court case. And that is that even though your vendor's legitimate email may be compromised and a fraudster sends a request to change banking from within your vendor's legitimate email, and then you make a payment to that fraudulent account, you can still be, or your company can still be on the hook, not just for the fraudulent payment that was made, but also to pay the vendor for the invoice that you made the fraudulent payment for. And so your company can be out twice that payment, the fraudulent payment and the legitimate payment to the vendor, if you do not follow your internal controls. That being said, there were actually two things that you can really look at as far as a fraudulent payment as a result of business email compromise, and one that involves the vendor as well. So, number one, if a threat actor infiltrates your business email accounts, and this is for the vendor, the court's decision does not rule out the possibility that you may be liable if that compromise could reasonably have been prevented. And the problem here is that Inotech couldn't prove that as far as Mobius's email system. Now, the second thing is the decision also confirms that if your business erroneously pays an invoice through fraud, you may be liable to also pay the legitimate invoice and so pay twice, which in effect is what happened today. Now, it goes further to say a reasonable verification process is essential to protect against payment of fraudulent invoices, especially where bank account details are changed or you are setting up a new vendor. The last thing they say here is that the law's view is that you must take reasonable steps to protect yourself from the risk of fraud. That being said, that means that whatever you say you're going to do, you need to do, which means you need to document it. So you need to put in, authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, vendor validations. You need to put all of that in place and you need to document it and you need to make sure your team members are following it. And so if you haven't visited the Vendor Process Training Center, make sure you do that because I have 63 training sessions, 24 vendor setup documents all designed to help avoid fraud, regulatory fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So if you haven't checked it out yet, go ahead and check it out. You can set up a free account and take advantage of the resource library that has content in it that'll help you, again, avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. It also includes tax reporting information because I know the vendor team, accounts payable team, right, usually has the responsibility of filing 1099s. It has vendor process FAQs. It also has new scam alerts. So you can see how the fraudsters are trying to get through your email inbox today, right, with the scams that they have. So make sure you check out all of that. I will or always have a link to the Vendor Process Training Center in the show notes. But whatever you do, wherever you get it from, make sure you put processes into place to avoid fraud and then make sure your team members are performing it. All right. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 323rd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.